Well, the good news is inflation has fallen to a 3.5-year low. The more difficult news for some people is that it might not be enough to see the Reserve Bank cut interest rates when it meets next week. So what does the latest inflation data mean, and does it at least signal that an end to the cost of living crisis might be in sight? Joining me this morning is Richard Dennis, an economist and executive director of the Australia Institute, and Andrew Barker, Head of Research at the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Andrew, let's go beyond the headline figures. What does the data actually tell us about the inflation situation that Australia is currently facing, where we are now?
So these numbers confirm that inflation continues to move in the right direction, which is good news. The headline rate of inflation has gone from 3.8% per year in June to 2.8% in the September quarter. So that's a big fall of 1 percentage point. But we can't overstate the significance of that, because a lot of that fall was due to one-off falls in petrol prices and a big fall in electricity prices due to temporary government subsidies. So together, they made up 60% or 0.6 percentage points of the 1 percentage point fall. And economists in the Reserve Bank focus more on core inflation, which excludes those sorts of volatile items like fuel and electricity. And on this measure, inflation fell from 4% to 3.5%. So still moving in the right direction, still good news, but also still clearly above the RBA's target range of 2 to 3%.
Andrew, still staying with you, do these figures put it in the Goldilocks zone the government and the Reserve Bank are aiming for?
So not quite. We know that the RBA is very focused on getting inflation firmly into the middle of its 2 to 3% range. And as mentioned, core inflation is still at 3.5%. So the Reserve Bank's forecasts don't see inflation coming back to the middle of their target range until for another 2 years. And so that's currently what we're seeing is in line with the Reserve Bank's forecast. They had forecast 3.5% core inflation by the end of the year, but not quite into the range that they'll be looking for yet.
Richard, you argue the government has actually brought this reduction in, like being responsible for bringing it down. How so?
Oh, look, I think the government has done some very helpful things, including the policies to lower energy prices, which have helped lower inflation and, let's be clear, have helped millions of Australians in the middle of a cost of living crisis. It was good policy. It put money in people's pockets and it lowered inflation. Look, I just find it remarkable. Here we are, we've got a headline inflation rate in the target range. We've got inflation lower than it's been for 3 years. And still we have economists saying, but if you measure it slightly differently, sure, it's in the target range now. But when we look at the trimmed mean, or when we look at this, or when we look at that, I mean, the reality is there are risks to the economy of keeping interest rates high. There are very real risks to the economy. And the Reserve Bank was below its target range for years. When inflation was below 2%, the RBA didn't panic and say, quick, would somebody please pump up the labour market, pump up the economy, inflation's too low. So this pedantry now, this sort of, but when you look at the trimmed mean, who knew that when Peter Costello wrote a letter to the RBA decades ago saying he wanted inflation to be 2 to 3%, who knew that we'd still be stuck with that arbitrary range, 2 to 3%? And who knew that we'd be going through the entrails of the 10 different ways to define the CPI? The real question is, what does the economy need right now? And I think it's time for interest rate cuts.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to put that back in your corner. You heard Richard's analysis there. How do you reflect on that?
Look, I think there are still some concerns about inflation in some parts of the economy. So if we look at services inflation, that remained at 4.6% for September, and that was higher than in the June quarter, which is being driven by higher prices for rents, which are up 7%, insurance, which is up 14%, education and medical, dental and hospital services. So there is still broad inflation pressure in the economy. That said, I take Richard's point that when we're when the Reserve Bank is setting interest rates, it needs to look at what's going on in the economy, obviously. And we have had relatively weak economic growth recently. And the Reserve Bank really needs to be forward-looking in setting its interest rates. So although its forecasts don't see core inflation coming back to the middle of its target band for another 2 years, when the Reserve Bank changes interest rates, there are lags of a year or even more before that actually has its full effect on the economy. So the Reserve Bank does need to be forward-looking and see that inflation is easing, as we've seen in this latest data, and be ready to cut interest rates next year if the data continues to move in this direction.
Okay, so when we're talking about next year, I know, Richard, you're making a broader point that you think it's time earlier, but realistically, given what the Reserve Bank is saying, when can people expect a shift on this?
Well, yeah, you're spot on. I mean, this is the point, that all the commentary that our newspapers are full of today is not what does the economy need, it's what do we think the RBA will do. Now, the RBA have done a terrible job of keeping inflation between 2 to 3%. Terrible job. It was way below 2% for nearly a decade. They didn't care. It went way above 3% when they said it wouldn't. So here we all are debating what the RBA, the people who haven't been very good at keeping it in the 2 to 3% range, will do, when the far more important conversation is what does the economy need. So, yeah, spot on. Like the data we're looking at is what happened in the past. And economists refer to this as, we're setting policy looking in the rear view mirror, not out the windscreen. The RBA is looking at what happened 3 months ago, when what we need to do is think what's the likely thing to happen next year. So, yes, I concur. I'm with all the economists. I reckon the RBA will do nothing. But wouldn't it be more important for a nation to have a conversation about what such a significant policy setter should do, rather than us all debate the consensus that they'll probably get it wrong again?
Andrew, final word to you, because we will hit AM and the news, which people I know wait for, so let's let them get it. Andrew, the Reserve Bank will make its rates decision next week. What do you think? I mean, is there more pressure on the bank given people are really struggling, or will it just hold again?
Look, the bank has a target of unemployment and inflation, and it will look at both of those measures. And I mean, to defend the bank, we haven't increased interest rates as high here as in a lot of countries that we normally compare ourselves with. And we haven't had a big increase in unemployment, which is a really important outcome. And the bank sees inflation going in the right direction. So there's the opportunity for a cut, but we expect to see that next year.
Expect to see it next year. We will. I'd love to revisit this with both of you too and see what happens. I really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Richard Dennis is an economist and Executive Director of the Australia Institute. Andrew Barker is the Head of Research at the Committee for Economic Development Australia.